So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Susanna Paisley, who was trained as a conservation biologist, and she did her PhD on spectacled bears in the Andean cloud forests of Bolivia, and I believe we're going to see some pictures of said spectacled bears. Susanna works as a designer, and she's really inspired by her field notes from her PhD and her research as conservation biologist. Her field notes, which have always been full of illustrations of flora and fauna that she encountered in the field. And these illustrations now form the basis of her nature celebrating textile and wallpaper designs for her company, Newton Paisley. She also is, as she's going to talk about today, is really inspired by the Tree of Life tradition. So without further ado, Susanna, I will leave you to talk about the Tree of Life motif, honoring nature in the home. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you. I'm going to try not to think about all those things you just said about the things that have been presented in this hall in the past, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to speak. Thank you for coming, and thank you. I'm not inviting you to listen to a lecture so much as to help me to think about what trees mean. I must be clear with you that I am a passionate enthusiast about the Tree of Life, and I'm a practitioner in that I make them, but I'm not an art historian and I'm not a design historian. So I want you to sort of help me to conjure up some ideas about the meaning. I just thought I would give you a few little points of what I'm going to talk about, because it is going to be quite wide-ranging and it's also going to be quite fast. But we'll talk about the sort of cosmic tree in culture, the tree as a form and potent symbol. I'll tell you my very peculiar journey to this point. We'll talk about the motif itself, and then I'll show you some of my designs where I use the Tree of Life design. The tree creates a lot of meaning for human beings. It is an emotional subject for people, and it's something that everybody connects to in their own lives. So it's interesting to take just a moment for you to think about what trees are in your own life, because there's no way that I can sum up the meaning. Whether you imagine climbing a tree or sheltering under a tree or planting a tree or pruning a tree or burning a tree, there's so many meanings that they have in all of our lives. They have so much symbolic power that they're almost too close to see clearly. We can't see the wood for the trees or the trees for the wood. They are some of the longest lived organisms on the planet. They're some of the largest organisms on the planet. There are trees that will survive beyond 100 human generations. It's quite extraordinary to think about the fact that the trees that are in our lives have a lifespan that's so far beyond anything that we will contemplate in our lives. I mean, they make forests, for goodness sakes. They make forests. They provide us with so much utility, and utility for the biosphere and so many other species. It is entirely immeasurable. But in terms of the meaning in various cultures, which this Tree of Life thing very much hinges upon, we're going to gallop through some of the meaning. I mean, you've got people like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, who would say that the ideas that we have about the cosmic tree go back to the Neolithic and extend from Mesopotamia to the Amazon, and, you know, from Oceania to Father Christmas's workshop in the North Pole. Trees are all over the place, but I'm just going to talk you through a few of them as the sort of great connector. This is what's she called? Tepantitla, who is from Teotihuacan, and she's a great goddess, and she's got priests who are giving her offerings, and she herself is spilling out her blood and water to give fertility to the earth, from the Mexican great cultures of around 101 to 500 or so of the Common Era. In the Buddhist tradition, you've got centrality of the Bodhi tree, the sacred fig tree under which the Buddha sat for 49 days and received enlightenment. There's lovely sort of heart-shaped leaves. There's so much in the Indian subcontinent about trees. In Hinduism, this is from about the 19th century. It's a Bundi style painting showing women making offerings to a peepal tree and Krishna sitting by a young tree there, and then the Kama, the god of love, floating above in the trees. In Chinese mythology, you often have a dragon and a phoenix at the top and bottom of a tree, but there's also a lovely Taoist tradition whereby there's a peach tree that produces a peach every 3,000 years, and whoever's lucky enough to eat it gets to live forever. In Islam, date palms are mentioned scores of times in the Quran and are revered. This is the Sidi Sayed Mosque, and this is a carved stone window dating to about 1570 something, and showcases a finely drawn set of trees. Again, this imagery is pervasive in that tradition. In the other great Abrahamic religions, you've got Judaism and Christianity, where of course you've got a rather confusing situation with regards to the tree of life, because you've got the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then you've got the tree of life. This is in the center of this image is the tree of good and evil, and of course then the apple is eaten and they're kicked out lest they eat from the tree of life, which would give them immortality. But of course they come back. The image of the tree of life comes back later in the form of the cross. In Genesis, it says, the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And after eating the apple, worried that the couple might eat from this tree of life as well, making them immortal, God expels Adam and Eve from the garden. In this drawing, you can see, done by Durrell in around 1500, you can see the tree of knowledge is the main tree there, but do you see Adam is holding a limb of an ash tree, a mountain ash, which is thought to be the tree of life, and that's just represented there. So there's a duality of trees going on in the Bible. It's also the ash tree that is revered in Norse tradition. This is Yggdrasil, who was the immense central sacred tree in the Norse tradition, and the Poetic Edda, which was a 13th century compilation of mythology and cosmology from that part of the world. And that's an ash tree to remind us of what they really look like on the side there. The illustration is from a 1908 translation of the book, but 9 realms of the Nordic world around this great enormous tree, which gets represented a lot in video games. Apparently Yggdrasil is very popular in video games. I myself come from a Quaker tradition. This is, by the way, this is the African subcontinent. They didn't really represent trees so much, but in this baobab tree is considered the tree of life, and there's a great deal of cosmology and mythology around, and deep meaning around trees in Africa as well. I am a Quaker by background, and this is actually a Shaker illustration done by Hannah Cahoon, and it's called The Tree of Light, or the Blazing Tree. It was done in 1845 during what was called the Era of Manifestations, which was a time of great spiritual revival. And although they were very plain, the Shakers, these were religious beamings into the mind of these often female artists, and they were often trees, and they represented the divine. And this has come to be the sort of iconic Shaker religious expression, that symbol. This is a Ukrainian tree of life embroidery. These are used in contemporary design, but that you can track them back, and it's believed that they go back millennia. And there's some extraordinary examples of how they track this very same motif, the same tree of life, back in history. Of course, it's the case that actual trees get worshipped as well all around the world. This is a fertility worship of Krishna under the peepal tree on the left-hand side there from about 1720, this art. And you can see it decorated with garlands and scarves to attract benevolence. It reminds me of when I lived in the United States when I was young, and you did trick or treat and you didn't give enough candy and your house would get rolled, which meant they would put toilet paper all over your trees, and it looked very similar, but this is a holy version of that. In the center is a Ukrainian wedding tree, which is made of dough all over the real branches of a tree. And then it's adorned with ribbons and tiny birds and feathers and all sorts of things. On the far right-hand side, I wonder if anyone recognizes that image. Yes, exactly. The murder trees, Melania Trump. That is the least naturalistic representation of a Christmas tree in the history of the world. But normally you'd have some kind of star at the top, which goes back in history to the axis mundi with the top of the tree reaching up to the pole star, and then the gifts around the base of the tree, the great gift of the Christ child, and so on, which you can track back through very deep history. So I then wanted to talk a little bit more about the tree just as a form and a potent sort of symbol. The branching structures of a tree have an innate poetry to them, which is hard to sort of define. Trees, I should say, branching structures can branch inwardly like a river, where all the little rivulets form one big river, which then goes down to the sea. And otherwise, you can also have the opposite of that, which is branching forms like a tree, where you have a large base and then it branches out to smaller structures, or indeed both, like lightning. And this is a fractal shape, so it can exist in eternal repetition, as it were, in a fractal form. And we think of them very much as being organic structures, but in fact, it happens in nature in cases where it is entirely inorganic. For example, this is diffusion limited aggregation. So this is a dendritic mineral crystal of manganese oxide. And people always think that somehow that is, it looks very like the sycamore from the Gap, doesn't it? That's that single tree, but this is entirely inorganic. And who can forget, as an additional inorganic formation of trees, the worryingly named viscous fingering, which I have a picture of here, which is something that you can repeat to spectacular effect in your own kitchen using some PVA glue, a little bit of food coloring, or some other soy sauce, or I used mulberry sauce the other night, distilled mulberry juice, and a little bit of washing up liquid, and you will observe this effect taking place before your very eyes, which is very thrilling. So it's a very powerful, potent thing, this branching idea. And in 2017, Isabelle Charmontier, who introduced me, did a very beautiful exhibition in the library upstairs, all about the use of the tree of life in the history of science. People tend to think that this was the first, but for biologists in the audience, this is absolutely iconic drawing that Darwin did. Yeah, that's you, I know. Trying to think about that, in 1837, and it came to really symbolize the theory of evolution. And then 22 years later, when he published The Origin of Species, he still believed in the idea of representing nature that way. I mean, it should be said also that Carl Linnaeus used bifurcating structures when he was thinking about systematics as well, and it goes back in fact to Plato and Aristotle. But believing still in the tree of life as an idea, he said, this is Darwin said, the affinities of all beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks the truth. The connection of the former and the present buds by ramifying branches may well represent the classification of all extinct and living species. His, I don't know if it's fair to say protege, but a great believer or proponent and promoter of Darwin's theory of evolution was Ernst Haeckel, who was a great illustrator and artist as well as naturalist. And he did this wonderful tree of life. It's interesting really though to reflect that a tree of life is how you imagine things are related based on the knowledge that you have at the time. And in early days, this was based on morphology, on how things were structured, how things were formed, what they looked like. But latterly, we've had the advantage of being able to look at DNA, and that is a whole nother kettle of fish. because there's something called lateral or horizontal gene transfer, which means that genes are actually moving those little sort of side branches you can see there in the tree by means of microbes largely. So it's more of a tangled thicket than it used to be imagined to be, but nevertheless, the tree of life continues to be the main way that we think about evolution. If you're interested in learning about that fascinating new way of looking at evolution, I recommend this book by David Quayman, who's always a delight to read. And if any of you are interested and haven't ever done it, onezoom.org is absolutely thrilling ride through the internet. You can look at any species that you're interested in, and literally, I think it's 2.2 million species that are included in this database. And this is over 3.8 billion years of evolution. And you can track down how things are related to each other. The color of the leaf represents their threat status. It's just thrilling. I've got on the large one there, you can see you've got the carnivora, and then you've got the bears. And so the second little red petal, unfortunately it's red because it's vulnerable, is the species of bear that I studied after the panda, which is the most evolutionarily distinct, branching off the tree first, and then the Andean bear that I studied, and then the rest of the 6 species of bears, and so on. But a very interesting way to while away 10 minutes. So I'll now tell you a little bit about my strange journey. In terms of a tree of life, how is that for an image? I didn't take that. That was taken last year. I should say also that I've not credited on these slides, and I'm not going to mention the names of all the photographers that I've used, but I am going to make a list of them, and they'll be online at the Linnaeus site if anyone's interested in tracking down. And thank you to all the photographers whose work I've nicked. So this is an Andean bear sitting in a tree in Ecuador covered with Spanish moss. And I never had an image quite that beautiful of a bear in all my years of studying them. But I did my PhD based here at the Institute of Zoology of the Zoological Society of London, and also the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology in Kent. I got my money to go out and launched myself into the middle of the Andes, the cloud forest, a very cold, wet, steep environment, to study these bears, about which very little was known at the time. I purchased a 1973 Toyota Land Cruiser, and I drove it for many, many hours up past Lake Titicaca, up into the back and beyond. There's a couple of people in this room that know it well who visited me while I was out there, for which many thanks. And on the right-hand side of the image, you can see the cave that I lived in. Now, for people at the Linnaeus Society, it's not necessarily that unusual that someone would spend time in a cave, but amongst the interior designers that I usually am talking to, I can tell you that they really don't think that was a very good idea. But eventually I was donated this little stone house by the community, and I got this very friendly local outlaw to come and hang out there and thatch the house, and I ended up living. I'll show you an interior view in a minute. This next shot is me and a bear. I don't have a picture of me and a real bear. Well, I do, because I trapped them and radio collared them, but they look like they're drugged, which they are, so I didn't show you any of those pictures. But I spent it took me 7 months to trap my first bear, during which time I was busy, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But I ultimately was out there for a couple of years, and I was in an environment which was, as it was cloud forest, it was very densely cloudy. In fact, it was 13,000 feet above sea level. So it was a little bit like when you fly into a cloud in an airplane, and your vision is just suddenly completely occluded by the density of the water vapor. So I couldn't see the bears across the valley. I couldn't really see much of anything a lot of the time. I should say I had no electricity, I had no phone, I had no communication stuff. So I was bored and going slightly out of my mind in a way. But the thing that saved me was that I became very, very obsessively, passionately interested in pattern. And it began to really light up my brain with pleasure, like when you listen to music that you know the melody of. And I think I became really hyper attuned to pattern in the midst of like hearing voices and whatever else in my isolation there. And I was very aware of the work of this marvelous woman called Maria Sibylla Merian, who was an absolute pioneer and went off to Suriname and did all these extraordinary illustrations in the mid-1600s. And she was, well, I won't go into her history too much more, but just to say she was a hero of mine. So there I was in my house and doing my illustrations and thinking, yeah, I'm a bit like Maria Sublimarian. This is great. So they've got my flower press there, and I did illustrations of, I had my guidebooks as well. And that was a big part of my experience of being there, was sort of learning to draw, because I hadn't had that training really before. And so I would draw the strange and marvelous plants in my environment. And then I used them in my studies, but I also brought them back with me. So that ends the episode in Bolivia, and then comes the crisis, which is epitomized by this image, which is me coming back to have to write my PhD and to supposedly work as an academic, which I did for 10 years or so. I found the monochrome, totally boring surfaces. I know certain people love a plain interior, but I myself went a little bit crazy in that environment, given how much I loved the stimulation of that. You know, nature is the ultimate maximalist, and that suddenly I was in this very bleak kind of environment with Euclidean geometry, and, you know, everything is just super, super clean and clear. And I also noticed that in the interiors world, there were quite a lot of representations of animals that were being sold to people. And I found them a little bit, they're irreverent, and whilst maybe graphically arresting in some ways, I felt personally, maybe they were a little insufficiently reverential towards the real species that I was very concerned about conserving and engaging with on a substantive level. And the other thing that I was really putting into the cauldron, which I would then stir to come up with what I'm doing now, I got really interested in propaganda textiles. Now, this is an obscure genre, I admit, but it's very, very interesting indeed. There's a rich archive of materials that you'll find if you look it up. This is a Nigerian cooking stove propaganda textile. So this would be made and sold into a market at a subsidized rate in order to influence people. And in a way, you know, being swaddled in a fabric, using a fabric, a curtain might be looked at for thousands of hours in your home. And if it's got a message to it, as William Morris said, all patterns should have meaning. If they have meaning, then all the better. You can sort of use that. So there I was with my illustrations that I'd done, and being very stultified in the academic environment. And then I thought, well, what if I could make my own propaganda textiles, biophilic type textiles that were making people think about conservation of endangered species. So I talked to my friends at the World Land Trust and figured out that it would be clever if for every meter of fabric that I sold and every roll of wallpaper, 100 square meters of wild habitat could be preserved through World Land Trust. So this is a very nice sort of spatial way of making a contribution to conservation that I probably wouldn't have been able to do myself that much. And it's wonderful to work with them. They're a wonderful organization. They've grown massively. And so on the 20th of September 2016, I launched my business, which is called Newton Paisley. And if you can see there, I launched it here at the Linnaean Society, which was a great thrill for me, because this place means a lot to me, and so it was absolutely marvelous occasion for me. So I'm now going to talk to you a little bit more about the tree of life motif in decor. It's a field that hasn't really been looked at before. I myself, you know, would see in the literature the idea of the tree of life. And I thought when I went to prepare this lecture, I would find it all very clearly laid out, and people would have analysed it a lot in the past. In fact, I didn't really find that to be the case at all. It's something that's a little bit sort of vague, but I'm going to lay out for you what I've been able to discover about this. So this is a 17th century tapestry made into a cushion. People didn't really upholster their homes in this time. And I should say, this is from the perspective of the UK, the Western Europe, and as a result, other parts of the diaspora that I'm giving this, because obviously this could be looked at from different cultural perspectives all over the world. But this is a British textile, and you can see that central image with animals on both sides. You've got somebody's hunting with a hawk, you've got people who are gathering fruit and so on, but it's not particularly what anybody would call a tree of life. It's more a representation of the tree as people would find it in their environment. I wanted also to mention, this is William Kilburn, who's an absolute genius. This is from the V&A's collection. This is a style of textile called a millefleur. And this is not unidirectional. Both types of tree of life designs that I'll talk to you about are to be seen from one angle, whereas the millefleur has the same sort of capturing the fleeting nature of flowers, but it can be used in any direction, which was an advantage. But you really have to look to our relationship with India to begin to understand the two types of tree of life that have become, that really predominate what people now think of as the tree of life. And these are palampores, both of the images that I have on this slide. So they would be single off-white chintz, which is cotton panels, and they'd be hemmed around the edges, and they would often be made for the right size for beds. The trade routes of that sort of determine how these things flowed are very complicated, and there's cruelty and misery and awful things to do with British East India Company and cotton and slavery and all that, but I'm not going to go into it. But just to say that this fabric was traded from India, from British East India Company to Southeast Asia in exchange for spices. So there's a lot of trade that's associated with these things, but in Britain, we had a great passion for them. They were treated with buffalo milk fat in order to not make the dye run. They had a special kind of nut powder that was used to treat the fabric, and then they used charcoal pins and all sorts of different natural dyes to create these incredible works of art, really. As I say, they were used mainly on beds in the early days. The one on the right was actually made for a different market. I think it was Sri Lankan market, the one with all the reds. Ours were mainly with a white ground. Some of you may recognize the image on the right there. That is the most famous tree of life textile motif in the world. There's a French textile company called Bronconi, and I think it was 1823 or something, that they started producing that design. And if you look at the image to the left, which is from the V&A's collection, you can see it may not have been precisely that one, but those almost half moon shaped branches that come off to the right at the base are suggestive of the idea that they may have copied it fairly closely from this original palampore. But that now has spread all over the world. There's Vogue articles. You can, through the pages of the interior design magazines, you'll see that cropping up time and time again. This is a Givenchy's country house somewhere with absolutely piled on the different layers of that design, which has become completely iconic. That room, of designers study that room, how that was done. William Morris, again, staying with this central tree. William Morris experimented with this is a tapestry that he himself designed on the left-hand side, and the one on the right is a tapestry that was created after his death, but very much in the same tradition that you will absolutely recognize. So we're now going to move from one type of tree of life to another type of tree of life. There's similarities, but to me, they're really quite different, but I've never heard anybody describe really where this transition took place or when, and I need to do more research about it because I'm absolutely fascinated. This is a piece of textile that I bought at the cloth shop on Berwick Street about 25 years ago, and I carry it around like my security blanket because I find it so beautiful, and it's just, it informs my own design, and I absolutely love it, but it's totally anonymous as far as I know who designed it. I did find somebody who claimed to have the original document, but I think it was just a recoloring and reworking of this original design. But this is the people who were in my workshop just earlier have created this sort of design, which is a repeating, interconnected tree of life design, which is quite different from that central tree. Although you'll see that the next slide I'm about to show you, which is a design by Joseph Frank, who was an Austrian designer who worked in Sweden. This is a Hawaiian-inspired tree of life that he did, but it's very much a recognizable through line. And he went to the MoMA in New York and studied those palampores and was inspired by them as well. So there's a real through line, but this is a interconnecting pattern like the ones that we did in the workshop today. I should have brought one up here to show you. The people did the most wonderful designs. It was just so exciting. Joseph Frank did, this sort of shows the process in a way that we went through today, although we use a slightly different system, but the first original drawing on the left-hand side, this is the drawing called Jungle, and then you can see he does the artwork, and then you can see it tiled out into repeat. So rather than having like a flower border in the central tree, it has to find a way to make sense and interlock with other trees. This is another one of his, it's called Vegetable Tree, again with a very straight stem, which some of our workshop participants favored this afternoon. The following slide is from 1937. Joseph Frank was creating those late 1800s, early 1900s. This was 1937, I think. And I wanted to show you to remind us that this is post Age of Exploration, and people are really thinking a lot about, they wanted in their textiles to be made to feel that sense of the exotic and strange. So in the Tree of Life, I think this is a very characteristic feature of the Tree of Life, is that there will be things will sprout out of the tree that couldn't biologically sprout out of the tree. That's definitely one of the characteristics. So you'll have odd flowers, and they tend to obey the laws of physics somewhat, that there'll be branches and things suspended from or perched on branches, but what grows out of them is entirely symbolic and imaginary and stimulating to metaphor and symbols, I guess you could say. There's a strange, my surname is Paisley, and I'm very, very interested in Paisleys for a long time. And there's a strange connection between Paisleys and the Tree of Life, in that one of the main theories of where it came from is that this is a Maharan, huge scale Paisley from the Cooper Hewitt in New York. But the theory is that this is an image from the sprouting of the date palm, and the date palm is considered the Tree of Life. In the cradle of all those Abrahamic religions. It's mentioned scores of times in their religious texts. And this is supposed to be another way of envisaging and honoring that Tree of Life. William Morris didn't particularly use the large trunk Tree of Life in repeating interconnecting designs, but he did use tendrils that connected in absolutely magical ways. And he, as you probably know, is all about nature and meaning in textiles. He didn't himself believe that you should very easily be able to identify a species. He wanted them to be a bit more stylized and more symbolic. But sometimes you can recognize these are willows and grapes, for example. And then this design was turned into willows, which is very much more famous, this design here. Sometimes when I talk about textile design, I show a very beautiful, several minute long, slow, I guess it's sped up film of leaves spreading on the branches of a tree. And the reason I show it, and I'll put it in the links from this lecture in case you're interested in seeing it, it's absolutely beautiful, but it's very much the same process that a textile designer uses, in that you're trying to fill space. There's a concept in design called horror vacui, which is the fear of empty space. So that's what I massively have with my monochrome white walls. But when you're doing a design, you want to try and fill the space in an even and balanced way. There's an idea called break spotting, where you don't want attention to be called to certain points in the design. So this is the same sort of thing that in this recent season that we will have all observed in the woods. You have leaf burst, and then those leaves are finding their way to the light. They're all evenly, spreading themselves out so that they can do the photosynthesis that they need to do and find their way in the world. Oh, it's so metaphorically rich, isn't it, in terms of all of us and how we live our lives. Anyway, not everybody loves pattern, though. And I thought I would just mention this charming gentleman called Adolf Loos, never has a name fit a man more, who said in 1910 that freedom from decoration was a sign of moral superiority. And he deemed bright colors primitive and childish and feminine. And all of those states are states of lower consciousness. And so the young men that I know who decorate their homes a very plain way, this is who you're following. You need to know that. There's a lot of people who really disagree with that idea and who design. And these days, there's a lot of people who love maximalism, like Carlos Mota, who wrote this book called Beige is Not a Color. And so thankfully, there are plenty of people to buy my work and the work of other wonderful designers who do this sort of thing, like, for example, Utopia Goods, who do this sort of tree of life stuff on the Australian flora and fauna to great success. So I thought I'd just show you now some of my own tree of life designs, and then there'll be some time for questions. So this is a design that I did using a lot of the illustrations that I did in the cloud forest. It actually literally has those same drawings that I used in it. And I was inspired in this by one of Joseph Frank's illustrations, which in turn was inspired by Capellas and Knossos. So you're allowed to steal things when you're when you're a designer, aren't you? And so I felt there was a wonderful lineage to the composition of this design, but I wanted it to feel like it was the cloud forest. So you've got those receding ridge lines in the background, and then there's my bears there, and then those wonderful turquoise flowers are the flowers of a tree, a plant called Puya atra, which is a bromeliad related to pineapples. And they really have those wonderful turquoise flowers. So that's used as a fabric a lot, and also as wallpaper. From all of my designs, I take one element and I turn it into what I call a pollinator print, and that Puya atra there, that turquoise flower, is pollinated by a hummingbird. And so I did a design based on hummingbirds that pollinate these amazing flowers, and that spherical shape with the very tall flower spike. In fact, that's the tallest flower spike in nature. It's a plant called Puya raimondii, and it flowers once every 100 years and dies. And there would be hundreds of tiny, tiny hummingbirds that would be pollinating those flowers when it would be in bloom, and a person standing there would be absolutely minute. They're enormous, enormous, enormous things. So that's used in a curtain. And then here it is. I did a collaboration with a very old-fashioned, wonderful furniture company called Howard that uses marvelous traditional old techniques and was favored by the Queen Mother. So that was a great thrill to work with them. And this is a sofa using that fabric. When I first started my career as a designer, I did all the artwork on one piece of paper and then had to take it to someone else to scan. So having made a plan for it, I executed it in one place in this occasion, and my lovely friend now has it in her house, which is nice because I can visit it. But I haven't followed with that method subsequently. I do the design on paper as we did today, and then I draw each of the elements separately, and then they find their place using Photoshop, and then I have that printed. But basically I'm hand drawing all the elements anyway, so it doesn't really make very much difference. This is a velvet made into a chair, and then a little nook, a little breakfast nook somewhere. A lot of my customers are in America, and this is called the Carolina Tree of Life, I should have said. So it features the extinct Carolina parakeet, which is in the middle there, and a lot of carnivorous plants, which are very famous from that area, including the Venus flytrap and salamanders. It's the highest diversity in the world of salamanders in that area. So I was highlighting. I try to have a mixture between species that are extinct and sort of or extremely endangered, and ones where there's perhaps a positive conservation story. I like to mix up it from a sort of editorial point of view, the narrative, and be positive as well as depressing. And also, you know, I need to look at what they look like and try and have beautiful, visually strong images, as well as something that might be very interesting but rather unattractive. Like, I think I'm the first person in the world to ever make a textile design featuring the naked mole rat. I did a design which wasn't Tree of Life, so I haven't shown you, but I do go for sort of what we call little brown jobs sometimes, but I do need to sort of balance the colors with the stories and the shapes, with the conservation message and so on. And also they tend to be based on one particular site. Sometimes I'll make a sort of field guide to the designs. All of the designs come with information about them, but sometimes I'll really go to town and turn it into more of a sort of field notes type thing. But I imagine doing that for every element of every design that I ever did. But unfortunately, running a business is actually time consuming. No one told me that. So I can't usually manage it. This is a design you might recognize. Step to the side here. I'm wearing a dress made of this fabric. And this is called the Mercy of Vines. It's based on the Lorax. If anyone knows the marvelous conservation parable, the Lorax. And my husband was in a musical about the Lorax, and so I wanted to celebrate the fact that our careers had converged for once. So I did this design where there are real world equivalents of the imaginary species from the Lorax, and this has been my #1 selling design. I think it's fair to say. I think it's really quite sort of a jolly. It's got nightingales and red squirrels, and actually I'm participating in an exhibition at Brantwood, John Ruskin's house, and I'm doing a special edition of this using the species that are native to further north. The red squirrels are a consistent feature, but the nightingales are being replaced by kingfishers and so on. So, and every now and again, someone will say to me, I like that design, but I hate squirrels. And so I will take them out. And I've done that a couple of times. People will come to me and say, because I put snakes and all kinds of bugs in my designs, and every now and again, people will say, no, I can't possibly have that. This design was interesting. This was for a big American company called Williams-Sonoma, who were doing some good agroforestry, really trying to look after species. At the same time, they were cultivating Theobroma cacao, the chocolate plant. And so this was a tree of life that I did for them, and they used it in various different products. At the bottom, that sort of lumpy thing at the bottom, that was a thing that I did because the tiny, tiny flowers, which are exaggerated in size in this design, are probably pollinated by this little tiny midge, and no one really wants to see a midge on their curtains. So I used microscopic photography of the midge, and I sort of stylized it into a little, what I called a midge flower. So they're represented in there, but in a way that people could tolerate, because strangely, people don't necessarily tolerate the things I think they should want to tolerate in terms of design. I do get that from people. And that little leaf-footed bug in the middle of that lozenge there, that's supposed to be a banana pseudostem. They chop down the bananas in these mixed agroforestry systems, and they leave the banana pseudostem, and that's a great place for frogs and different insects to reproduce. But I used that central bit for a leaf-footed bug, which was an homage to my heroine Maria Sibylla Merian, who did that bug when she first went and saw areas where chocolate was grown. So it was made into, they used it on these products where they sold chocolate truffles and so on. And it was an interesting experience working with them, with a big company. But here it is. It's very successful as a design. People love chocolate, and so it's nice to be surrounded by it, and certain people who like chocolate that I can think of. This is a design. It's not a traditional tree of life design. It has almost a sort of stitching of the Caledonian pine from Allerdale, which is a reserve in the north of Scotland, up by Inverness, where they're doing a spectacular rewilding work. And so this is more of a scenic design. So you do have a central tree there, but it doesn't link up in either of the two ways that I described a tree of life. But I just thought you might be interested in it anyway. It has the only endemic bird to the British Isles, the Scottish crossbill, and the wildcat and grouse and pearl bordered, no, not pearl bordered fritillaries, but the mussels you can see the little pearl mussels in the river there, and so on. So that can be done in a large scale, as it is in that design. And finally, this is a design that I did for the Max Planck Institute of Conservation and Ecology the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior in Konstanz in Germany. And this is about the balsa tree and all the species that take advantage of all the nectar in the flowers, which they flower at night. And there's lots of these medium-sized mammals. This is at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute on Barra, Colorado Island. So they had done all this research there. So the scientists now have this really big mural effectively in the walls with all sorts of creatures there represented. They don't mind having snakes. And that as you might recognize, really pays homage to those tree of life designs that you saw in the beginning. So I just wanted to end with the idea of biophilia again, which is the longing for reconnection with nature and natural systems. And I think that's what the tree of life does for me as a sort of wannabe maker of conservation propaganda textiles. The tree has leverage, it has a sort of meaning for people. And then together with the kind of harmonious power of pattern, there's this wonderful quote by a man called Christopher Marley, who's an artist who is a pattern maker, stunning work. And he described it so well. He said that I found that when my subjects are meticulously composed, it makes the translation more intelligible. Just as random music notes, once properly orchestrated, can enter the heart and sway it almost against our volition. And that's what pattern does for me. That's the incredible feeling that I had when we did our workshop today, and people have done these designs and they're just seeing it once and then you repeat it out, and it has a sort of magic to it for me. And I think it does for other people as well. And my hope is that will make people feel, this cocktail will make people feel, connected to nature in their, which in fact is the great challenge of our time, isn't it? People have to be reconnected to nature or we're done for. So I hope we've managed to think good tree-ish thoughts together and that you found this survey interesting. And I just am very grateful to you for coming to hear me talk. If anyone has any questions, I'd be delighted